Welcome to the Fried Egg Golf Podcast. I'm Garrett Morrison, and at long last, it is Open Championship Week. The last men's major championship of 2024 will be starting tomorrow at Royal Troon Golf Club in Scotland. So today, Joseph, LaMagna, and I thought we'd look back on the last Open held at Royal Troon, which was in 2016, and which everyone remembers for the incredible Sunday duel between Phil Mickelson and Henrik Stenson. So Joseph and I rewatched that final round, which is available for free on YouTube, to see what, if anything, it can tell us about what to expect this week at Troon. We'll also discuss some early reports on the condition of the course and the outlook of the weather, and we'll offer a few picks and predictions to wrap up the episode. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, Club Champion. Club Champion helps golfers of any skill level play better golf through custom-fitted and custom-built equipment. They have extensively trained master fitters who use an in-depth, data-driven, tour-level fitting process. They use industry-leading technology like TrackMan and Sam Putt Lab to record your data in real time. They have 65,000 hittable head and shaft combos in the shop, including all of the new 2024 brands, and they're pretty easy to find. They have 120-plus studios nationwide. Club Champion's fittings produce real results for every level of player, including an average of 20 extra yards off the tee. Finally, they offer a perfect fit guarantee. So if your Club Champion custom-built clubs don't deliver what you see in the hitting bay, you can go back within 90 days and get them adjusted so that they perform how you want them to. So for Fried Egg listeners, this is the deal that Club Champion is offering. Right now, you can use the code FRIEDEGG to get 50% off the cost of your fitting with the purchase of a club. So go to clubchampion.com and book your fitting today. Again, that's code FRIEDEGG, all one word. All right, Joseph, let's get into our discussion of Royal Troon as the Open Championship approaches. First, I want to talk a little bit about what we've heard about the course so far this week. We are recording this on Tuesday, and of course, the tournament starts on Thursday. What we've heard so far is that the course is in good condition, that there's a little bit of bounce in the fairways, but that the greens are going to be softer and maybe slower than expected because it's been a wet spring in the UK. It has not been hot, and so the course hasn't really had a chance to bake out yet. It's also possible that, the R&A just hasn't pushed the greens super far so far. But if the greens are a little bit softer than expected, how do you think that changes things going into the tournament?
Yeah, I would love to see it firm. Obviously, I think most people would. A windy, firm links test is probably the best version, but I think the main things it changes is that short-sightedness is not as much of a penalty, so it allows you to be a little bit more aggressive on some of your approach shots, and then there's just a little bit more predictability on your iron shots and getting your distances right because it's not as subject to the bounces that the greens might generally have otherwise. And if they're a little bit slower, it's just a little bit easier to get your numbers correct. So we'll see how they play. I'd love to see it get a little bit firmer and faster. But as you mentioned, given the conditions this summer and the weather that they've had in that area of the world, it's probably not a realistic expectation.
The other thing we've heard is that the weather will be probably a bit unpredictable. There's low confidence in the details of the forecast so far. But right now, what we're hearing is that there could be some kind of storm or some windiness Wednesday evening leading into Thursday morning, and just general kind of like rains here and there, winds here and there. We don't know really what to expect. So what have you seen from the forecast so far, and how has that been factoring into your thinking about about what to expect?
Yeah, I'm not putting too much stock in the weather reports at this moment because, as we know, that can change quickly. I think a unique feature of Royal Troon that's worth spending time thinking about is the routing and how generally the prevailing wind, you're downwind on the front nine and into the wind on the back nine. And so just thinking about weather and timing of when you're playing is a big deal. That's something that played a crucial role in the 2016 Open Championship that I'm guessing we'll talk about. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the ocean course at Kiowa Island in the way that the routing, like you're headed one direction for one nine and then another direction for the other for another nine. Another tournament Phil Mickelson did pretty well in. So it's not the best comparison necessarily, the ocean course and Royal Troon, but in thinking about weather patterns and how that can impact play, I don't think it's an unreasonable comparison.
Yeah, and the unpredictability is a common thread, right? At
Sure.
Kiowa, the weather can be one thing in the morning and another thing in the afternoon very easily, and none of it typically matches the forecast exactly. So it's tough to put too much stock into it, but we could see a wave split again, right? That's a distinct possibility whenever you have an Open Championship, but especially one on the west coast of Scotland, where things just seem to be a little bit dicey and hour to hour out there by the ocean. So in any case, we have heard a couple of things from players so far this week about the golf course. A few things from press conferences that I found interesting. The first is that a lot of players seem to agree that it is a tale of two nines. In fact, a couple of different players use this exact phrase, a tale of two nines, that if you're going to score at Royal Troon, then you'd better do it on the opening nine, because the closing nine, the homeward nine, is going to be really tough. There aren't a whole lot of opportunities for easy birdies coming home. Has that been your general impression looking at the course?
Yeah, and I really liked this quote that friend of the pod, Sean Martin of the PGA Tour had tweeted. He's apparently, this is a quote from Tom Watson that he said of Royal Troon. It's sort of like playing the Chicago Bulls. You know, at the end of the game, they're going to be coming back at you, so you better get off to a pretty big lead. And yeah, I think that's appropriate. It's being echoed by players. Some pretty gentle handshake type holes to start, and then you're playing into some beefy holes on the back nine that often play into the wind. So I agree that that's how I envision it playing out as well.
I really liked how Iona Stephen put it in the Golf Digest Every Hole video. The script was written by others, but she was the narrator of the video. And what she said was that the first 6 holes are heaven, the next 6 holes are purgatory, and the final 6 holes are hell. That's not an exact quote, but that's the spirit of what she was saying. Basically, those holes going out along the coastline are your opportunities. A few sub 400 yard par fours and just some opportunities to get up near the green with your tee shot, especially for these players. And then the middle stretch of the course, things get tougher and tougher. You're in some more choppy land. You have some more uncomfortable tee shots and looks on your approaches into greens. And then the holes coming home are just tough. A lot of long holes, a lot of long irons, and just a lot of trouble that you can get into, some incredibly penal bunkers and things like that. So I like that way of thinking of Royal Troon in kind of 3 phases. But opening 9 versus final 9, that's really going to be a big theme of the week. Now, the most interesting thing that I heard from a player, and I wanted to get your take on this, Joseph, was unsurprisingly from Tiger Woods. He always says the most interesting things about the courses that they're playing for major championships. So it's no surprise that he came out with this one. But what he said basically is that you'll see a lot of guys laying up to the same spots on these holes, especially if it's windy. So, what he said exactly, this is the quote. He says, there will be occasional areas where with the right wind conditions, guys can be aggressive, especially some of the longer hitters. They can be aggressive. It does allow for that. But in general, if we get the winds we're forecasted, I think we're all going to be playing from about the same areas. This is kind of something I saw in 2016, something that we saw in that final round, the duel between Mickelson and Stenson. A lot of the time they were kind of playing to some of the same areas and fairways. Do you think that's going to be what we see this week, or has the game changed a bit since 2016?
Didn't know we were going to be getting into this right off the top, Garrett, but it's actually one of my favorite attributes of Royal Troon. I think people could take the other side of this and argue that it's boring when people play into similar spots, but it's not as if the holes are cut off at driver length. There are a couple that play that way, but generally speaking, a defining characteristic of Troon is that the fairways are relatively narrow, often about 28 to 30 yards wide, but then get narrower at driver length. And they don't then just widen back up to where you can bash driver if you're one of the longest players. So there's a lot of penal pot bunkers in the fairways in strategic positions that you need to avoid. And that's why you're going to often see players hitting things like iron and wood off of a lot of the tee boxes. But I don't view it as a negative. I think those shots in and of themselves, the firmer the golf course is, and if there's wind, are demanding shots in their own rights. And it's not like everyone's just getting up and hitting a simple 4-iron into a generous landing area and then everyone's flipping a wedge in. So I think it's a little bit more dynamic than that. Wind is a massive factor. And to Tiger's point, there are a couple opportunities where, especially if you're downwind, which tightens your dispersion, there are some opportunities to let it rip a little bit. I think the third hole is a good example to look at. And in the right conditions, some of the longest hitters may be able to push their tee shots up near the green, which is a risk worth taking, right? If you take on a risk with the driver and it's the difference between having 120 yards in or 160, like that's not as good of a risk to take. But if it can be the difference between having 130 yards in and having like 30 yards in, like going over a hazard versus laying back behind it, that's a risk that there's quite a bit of payoff involved in. So in the right conditions, especially downwind, which again does tighten your dispersion, there are going to be some opportunities to be aggressive off some of the tees.
Now, a final thing that Tiger said that I wanted to note, this is an observation just about links golf in general, I think, but I like the way that he put it. He said, over here, you can run the golf ball 100 yards if you get the right wind and the right trajectory. It negates somewhat of the high launch conditions that most of the times you see on the tour that populate the world nowadays. And so maybe this is sort of wishful thinking on Tiger's part, but I think there's a kernel of truth to it that, distance off the tee on a links course where there's wind and firm turf is not so much a factor of high launch and pure ball speed as it is situational awareness, the ability to control trajectory, and the ability to maximize your distance in any given situation, depending on the conditions of the ground and the wind. And so I think that's something that gets at something that I really appreciate about the Open Championship. And it's that you see players, older players, who truly know how to control their shot shape and everything else off the tee, being able to compete with some of the bombers because they're able to get distance in different ways. I don't think it's an original observation about links golf. This is often said, but I just like the way that he phrased that. That's something that I do like when it comes to this tournament.
And I think as part of that, it's important to recognize that part of the reason that works at Troon is because the gorse bushes, which often sit off the fairways, impose a very stiff penalty. It's not like finding just a little bit of rough like we see on a lot of PGA Tour week in and week out tests where you still have a shot. It's a scary penalty when you go into the gorse bush, especially on some of the holes out there. So just another thing to motivate players from being a little bit more conservative off the tee. I think off the tee, this golf course is amazing.
All right, let's get into the 2016 rewatch. You and I went through the final round telecast, which I believe was the Sky Sports telecast. I think that Sky Sports, this was like their first effort at an Open Championship final round telecast. I think before that it was BBC, but so we got the Sky Sports version of it, not the US version of the telecast, and so it was quite good. This is something that you notice when you switch to what people across the pond have access to, that it's a very good and insightful piece of television. But in any case, I came up with a few categories to go through, some awards that we could give to different aspects of the final round and the play that we saw. Is this copying the Rewatchables podcast? Who could say? It might be inspired by a segment on the Rewatchables, but we're doing our own version of it here. So I wanted to start with what you think is the coolest hole based on what we saw in the 2016 final round. And I want to talk about a hole other than the postage stamp, which we kind of went into in depth in the podcast that I did with Sam Cooper a few days ago. So what was the coolest hole that you saw?
I think the 11th hole at Royal Troon might be one of my favorite golf holes in professional golf, not just at Royal Troon, obviously. It's a burly par 4, plays almost 500 yards, often plays into a prevailing wind, and that tee shot is incredibly intimidating. You have railroad down the right side that's out of bounds, gorse on either side of the fairway, kind of a little bit of an awkward angle to hit the tee shot. We saw in 2016 in rewatching it that Henrik Stenson, I believe he took 3-wood off the tee, pulled it a little bit, but not much, and was basically in the first cut, not too far from the gorse that lines the left side, and his view of the green was obscured. There's so much going on that whole visual intimidation off the tee, some obscured sight lines into the green, super difficult hole, probably one of the most intimidating tee shots in professional golf, maybe in the Open Championship Rhoda, one up there. I remember Thomas Pieters snapping his club and throwing it into the gorse bush in this championship. That wasn't shown on the telecast, but it's a hole where you're going to see some blow up. So I think that's one of the coolest holes in professional golf. Garrett, I'd be curious your opinion on the 11th.
I wonder if Thomas Pieters' club is still there. If they made a little statue out of it. That's the kind of plaque that I'd like to see on a golf course.
Yeah.
I love 11. I like the way the fairway moves, in the landing zone, the way it kind of starts away from the railroad and then moves on a diagonal to the railroad. So basically, the more aggressive you want to get, the farther up you want to get on the hole, the more you kind of have to adjust your line toward the railroad, which is super uncomfortable. And it's all blind. You can see a little bit more out to the left there. But if you're going to the right, if you're going straight down the fairway, then you're basically completely blind. And I think that's a tee shot that's so uncomfortable for players these days, because it's just hard to come up with a point to aim at. Even on the 10th hole, which is also a blind tee shot, you're hitting over a big set of dunes and waist area type bunkers. And so there are various things that various reference points that you have. You can, once you know the course, the basic dimensions of the fairway. But on 11, I think that it's just kind of barren. There's not much to hook into when you're trying to come up with an aiming point. And that's a tough thing for players who are more used to kind of certainty and everything being out in front of you, as the phrase goes. So, another hole. Yours? Yeah, another hole that I like. 7. I just think this is a fun drive and pitch hole. This was, I believe, the most famous hole at Royal Troon before the postage stamp was designed for or took on its current form for the 1923 Open. But really fun tee shot with lots of different options off the tee. The fairway kind of wraps around a dune that's on the right side of the hole corridor. So the fairway kind of swings out to the left and then slants back to the right before straightening out for the approach to the green. Short left is kind of the safest spot to be, but it's the least advantageous. Short right requires challenging some bunkers on the right side, and maybe your approach is kind of blind from over there because you're hitting over the dune. and then you have options to go long. And I think a lot of the players in this tournament are going to look to get up by the green, depending on where the tee is and what the wind is doing. But I think we'll see some variety of play on 7. But in 2016, both Phil and Henrik laid up on this hole, or kind of laid up on this hole. I'll have to look at my notes. I know Henrik did, and he was kind of out to the right a little bit on his layup. Phil actually, I remember now, pushed up a little bit more, but he was kind of on the left side and ended up with kind of a weird lie where he wasn't able to get any spin on the ball. And so there was some variety of play there. Laying up was a legitimate option for players in 2016. Maybe we'll see players being more aggressive this year with the hole because the fairway is fairly wide up by the green. And I think that, players will see an advantage in getting up there. But that's a very interesting hole. And the green side is just beautiful. It's kind of set between these two dunes and kind of benched in there. And it's a classic links golf green site. So I really like 7.
I can't speak too much on it, Garrett, because I'd be getting ahead of myself into potentially the next award that we're doing here. So
okay. So the next award is coolest green complex.
I picked the 7th, and of all the awards we did, this was probably the most challenging one for me because
it's hard to see the greens on the telecast, right?
Yeah. And
I mean, you just see where the pin is and you see where the ball lands, and it's a little bit hard to tell.
And you might have a differing view. I don't think the appeal of Royal Troon, at least for me, is the green complexes necessarily. They're pretty small and they don't have a ton of contouring, and at least to my eye that
it's
I've
subtle contouring. It's there.
Right.
And some of them are a little bit modernized, which is, what we see at Open Championship venues these days. Some of the greens don't quite feel antique. They have some of those little runoffs and stuff that Mackenzie and Ebert like to put into green complexes that they rebuild.
Yeah, I don't think they strike fear. The green complexes strike fear into players the way that a lot of green complexes do in professional golf. But what I like about the 7th, a recurring feature of this golf course is that generally the greens are narrower in the front and then expand in the back. They often have a pot bunker, short right and short left, and like a little neck that you can run the ball up. Running the ball up's not a great option, but it's possible. The 7th is different. Like you mentioned, it's set in a beautiful dunescape, but it's a little bit more, it's wider in the front and then a little bit narrower towards the back of the green. And yes. I just find it visually appealing, really cool and completely different than the rest of the golf course. I think it stands kind of by itself. There's not another green that looks like it on the golf course. So it scores a lot of points for me in the variety category, and just it's aesthetically pleasing. So that's the one that I will nominate. It's not really a contour based, how putts are going to play based argument, but I just think it's a beautiful golf hole.
Yeah, and something to watch out for, I think, on 7 is if the pin is in the back, how aggressive are players going to be? Because I think a lot of players are going to want to be really short of that pin because, going over the back to a back pin would be very, very bad on that specific golf hole. And so that's a place where players will have a real choice about what distance they're hitting their kind of short approach into that hole. I think, like, for instance, if they decide to move the tee up a particular day and make the hole almost drivable, then they might put that back pin in there to create a little bit more difficulty and give the players another question to answer. So we'll see what they do with that. For me, the coolest green complex, the one that I really liked, is another pretty subtle one in terms of internal contour, but it's 10.
Okay.
No bunkers on 10. It's oriented so that the deepest look that you have at the green, the way that the green is deepest for you from the fairway is from the left side. And there's just this massive fall off on the right side of the green that's very, very intimidating. But then missing left leaves you this kind of tricky recovery over some contours that run along the left edge of the green. On the little verite documentaries that the RNA posts on their YouTube channel during Open Week, which I absolutely love and really recommend. It's called Inside the Open or something like that. Just a little series of very kind of like slice of life footage of players preparing for the Open. But there was some footage of players, including Tiger and I think Justin Thomas, practicing some chip shots from the left side of the 10th green, and they're very, very tough. It's trying to figure out how high to play your ball and what kind of spin to put on it and where to land it. All that stuff is super tricky from the left side of the 10th green. So something to look out for is if players want to avoid that right side fall off, which is so obvious, like it's like 10 feet, it's like, I can't go there. Do they, hedge toward that left side and then end up with a very tough up and down situation? I also really like the 6th green, not so much for the shaping of the green itself, which looks a little bit modern to me, but the way the approach to that green works. This is a long par 5, and a lot of players might be able to go for the green in 2. It's 620 something yards, but they'll still be able to go for it if they get a good tee shot. The approach to that green is really smart. Basically, there's a bunker kind of short left of the green, well short of the green. It's where a lot of players might want to be landing their second shots to run them up onto the green from distance. You don't want to be in that bunker. It leaves just such a savage bunker shot. And so some players who might want to be a little bit safer but still get their ball up by the green might go a little bit left. But from there, the approach to the green kind of falls off to the left and will kick balls down into this little area that leaves a very tough pitch shot over a short left bunker. And so the choices that players make in approaching the 6th green will be very interesting to me. All right, let's talk a little bit about players in the 2016 championship. Let's start with the category. I was shocked to see this name. Who did you not expect to see involved in this championship?
For me, it was Tyrrell Hatton. Absolutely. I had no idea, honestly, that he was involved in this tournament at all. I didn't really realize that his career was even as promising back in 2016. He hadn't had too much of a professional career at that point. I think he'd missed 4 straight Open Championship cuts in a row coming into that tournament, but
it might have been even less than that, but it was like, yes, he 3 or 4 missed cuts. Yeah.
Yeah. And those were the only, I think he played in 1 PGA, a few Opens, and that was it.
And he hadn't won on the European Tour yet.
He's 24 at the time. Yeah. Finishes T5. I didn't expect to see him at all. And now seeing how much better he's gotten and how successful his career is now, like he's a legitimate name to consider in the 2024 Open Championship. Didn't expect to see him.
Yeah, my pick was baby-faced Tyrrell Hatton as well. Did not remember that this was kind of his coming out party, his first top 20 in a major even. T5, really, really strong finish. But obviously since Stenson and Phil were so far out in front, it's understandable that you would miss some of the guys who came 3rd, 4th, 5th in 2016. Another player who placed solo 4th in his case was Steve Stricker, 49 years old at the time. I didn't remember that he played so well in this championship. I of course remember that he had a lot of longevity and that he had some good performances into his late 40s, but this was one of his last real appearances on a big major stage. Solo 4th, he did pretty well. All right, let's
and of course
identify.
This was the Beef Johnston major, which I think people probably do remember, but
yes,
it was just interesting to kind of revisit that.
This was the height of beef mania. The announcers had a bunch of beef puns at the ready. That approach was a little undercooked. That was undercooked beef and things like that. So people were really having fun with beef. All right, for the next category, let's identify one thing that would not happen in 2024 that did happen in 2016.
Yeah, I think this is going to be an interesting litmus test because the game of golf has changed radically since 2016. Ton of speed now, and there aren't too many short hitters. Yes, you can, of all majors, this might be one that invites a variety of playing styles, but there's a lot of long hitters out there now. So what I picked was you're not going to see a lot of driver 5-iron into the 15th hole, which is 500 yard par 4 that often plays into a prevailing wind. I think this will be a good litmus test. Phil hits driver 5-iron in the final round into a slight breeze, pretty mild conditions in that final round. So That tee box should be the same as it was in 20. Some holes have been extended, but the 15th, I believe, is in, if not an identical location, very close. So I think that's a good one that's held constant over time. Let's see in reasonably calm conditions what a player like even Phil today, like I bet he's hitting driver 7-iron today. So I'm interested to see what those distances kind of look like compared to the almost a decade ago, but it's going to be radically different.
For my thing that wouldn't happen in 2024, I looked at the clubs that Stenson and Phil hit in the final round off of each tee. And what I came up with at the end was that Stenson hit 7 irons off of the non-par 3 tees at Royal Troon in the final round in 2016. He hit 5 3-woods, right? His famous 3-wood, his bomb 3-wood that would go as far as some players' drivers. He hit 5 of those, and then he hit 2 drivers. Phil hit 7 irons off the tee, hit 2 fairway woods, and hit 5 drivers. I'm going to say that whoever wins this year is not going to hit just 2 drivers off the tee in the final round as Stenson did in 2016. I might be wrong about that. It could be that players hit a lot of irons off these tees, as you were expressing earlier. There are reasons to lay up in some of the same areas as other players at Royal Troon. There are reasons to let your foot off the accelerator a bit on some of these tees. But I just don't think we're going to see a winner who hits only 2 drivers. What do you think about that?
Yeah, Stenson's a little bit of a unique case in that
it is. It's kind of cheating. I mean, maybe we won't see a winner who hits 5 drivers off the tee, which Phil did in 2016.
Yeah, I will say I think you're going to see a decent amount of iron and 3-wood off of tees. But to your point, yes, I think the chances that there are only 2 drivers hit in the final round by the winner are close to 0, right? Because you're going to get them on both the par 5. Well, not necessarily both the par 5s in the front, but likely. There are more than 2 expected drives. There's no doubt about that.
All right, let's talk about our shots of the day. What was your shot of the day?
A few different ones stand out here. I mean, Garrett, I'm sure you had a similar takeaway, but there were almost no missed shots the entire day. Like both of these guys.
Were they in a single bunker? I was trying to remember this. Was anybody, was Phil or Henrik? I don't think they were in any bunkers.
I don't remember. I mean, there's a little bit of them in the fescue, but just overall, They step up and flush it over and over again. It's absolutely incredible. So yeah, highly recommend people going back and watching it. It's just an unbelievable display of golf. The one that stood out to me is the iron that Phil hits into the 4th hole, the par 5. He hits a 237-yard long iron to about 10 feet and makes eagle. And so that is at the 45.5-minute mark on YouTube, on the YouTube clip. The reason I pick it is because a minute later on the telecast, they show his swing from kind of straight on, like you're looking at his chest, and they do the swing in slow motion. It is remarkable how fluid and impressive Phil's swing is in that round, in that particular swing. I'm not a student of the golf swing. Like I'm not very knowledgeable about the golf swing, but when you watch that, it's unbelievable to see his club position and how well he generates speed. Like just a magnificent swing. So I would highly recommend people go back and watch that slow-mo swing at the 46.5-minute mark. Again, you could pick so many different shots from that day, but that one really stands out to me as just an unbelievable golf shot. How about you, Garrett?
Well, for anybody who doesn't remember that Phil Mickelson was one of the greatest iron players of all time, go and watch this final round. Because this is a good demonstration of what he was capable of. Yeah, his chips and pitches were very impressive and kind of flashy, but his iron play is really what I think made him a many-time major winner, made him the second best player of his generation. Those irons that he hit at Troon were absolutely incredible. It just happened to be the case that Stenson was up to that challenge, right? Because Stenson, also one of the greatest iron players of all time. And maybe that's a kind of theme that we'll see it for many players who do well at Troon. But my shot of the day, I had a few candidates. I ultimately chose Phil's approach into 10. He was in the fescue. The ball was way below his feet, and he couldn't complete his follow through. He had to kind of hit a sawed off follow through because he didn't have the balance to go all the way through the ball. And he hit it to, I don't remember exactly how close it was, but maybe 10 feet or something like that.
From like 170, right? He had about 170 in.
Absolutely incredible shot. Like, just given the circumstances, given the pressure, and given his lie. I mean, a lot of players would be happy to be kind of left of the green on 10 with that shot, but no, he was attacking the flag from that position. Just an incredible shot. There were, I think a lot of people probably remember a couple of shots that Phil hit on the first 2 holes. This was the indication right out of the gate on Sunday in 2016 that this was going to be a legendary duel. I remember these shots. It was Phil's approach into 1, where he hit it to a couple of inches, right? Big statement. He was 1 back of Stenson. And then there was a 2-shot swing on the first hole because Stenson bogeyed the hole and Phil stuck it to literally a few inches and made birdie. And then Phil's chip on 2 after missing the green to the right.
Short right, yeah.
Yeah. He had to hit this little chip from a tight lie over a short right bunker to a pin that was pretty tight to that bunker. There was no backstop, and he just hit a beautiful, crisp Phil Mickelson chip that lipped out. That shot could have gone in
easily.
So the Phil, it's funny. The Phil shots are the ones that stand out, even though Stenson ended up putting him away in the last few holes. And obviously Stenson making some big putts down the stretch. The one on 15 from 25 feet was totally unexpected, and maybe it was even longer than that.
I think it was longer.
But yeah, it might have been more like 30 to 40, but he was across the green from the hole, and that one was not expected to go in. And then his tee shot on 17, the long par 3, 4-iron from 220. Yep. So there must have been some interesting wind conditions happening, or, just the game has changed a lot from 2016, but we would see Bryson hitting a pitching wedge these days. That tee shot he hit on 17 was just a classic Henrik Stenson iron. It's a little explosion at the at impact when he hits an iron well, and that was one of those irons. And something about that shot. I know I'm talking about like a lot of shots here, so I'm super cheating on these categories. But
you are cheating.
My bad. But there's this video that Live Golf put out with Phil and Stenson discussing the 2016 final round. They put this out a couple of days ago, and it's pretty good. I wish they had gone a little bit more in depth, but they do talk about certain shots. And Phil talks about being stunned on 17 specifically, that shot that Henrik hit, because it was so high. And Phil was thinking he can't possibly hit it that high and have the ball reach the green, because he's putting the ball way up in the air where the wind is going to act on it, and he's going to come up short. He can't get all the way there hitting the ball that high. But it got all the way there. And there was just something about Stenson's ball flight that was so penetrating, where he hit the ball so solid and maybe just kept some spin off of it, and it didn't get caught up in the wind. He just hit these shots that bore their way through the wind. And that's what made him almost unbeatable at Troon. And the fact that Phil got anywhere close to him is a testament to how spectacular he was on certain shots in that final round, and really on those final 2 days. All right, not finally, but we have a couple of final big categories here. But the final kind of detailed category. Let's talk about the biggest what if moment in the final round.
I might have interpreted this question a little bit differently as a broader what if.
That's fine.
Forgive me if I deviated from the prompt, but my biggest what if is just if players had gotten different tee times. And this is a historic wave split of the 11 golfers that finished T9 or better. 9 were from the early wave.
Yeah,
both Stenson
it's like 4
and
shots,
Phil,
right?
It was a lot of shots. I don't have the exact count in front of me, but it was a lot of shots. Both Stenson and Phil were late. Tyrrell Hatton was one of the last tee times on Thursday. Like, that's the side that got the beneficial draw. So we wouldn't, I mean, if Phil or Stenson had received a different draw, like we would not be talking about this championship the same way. It might have been a snoozer with one player completely running away from it, right? If Rory or Jason Day, who was number one at the time, had been on the right end of the draw, then we might just be talking about a completely different championship. So this is one that stands out as an all-time draw. Garrett, of the top 17, there were two more in the late wave. Sorry, only two more on the wrong side of the split. Gary Woodland, and then do you want to guess the other player who, of course,
could it be our lad from Northern Ireland?
So yes, you're correct that Rory was. But sorry, of the players between like T9, behind T9 and T17, the other one was Patrick Reed, which I just find amusing for being on the wrong side of the draw.
That was intentional on the RNA's part.
So not immune to a bad draw there. So thought it was an amusing tidbit.
Life in the line drive section. That's Patrick Reed's autobiography title, I believe. The biggest what if for me was a little more specific. What if Phil's putt on 16 dropped? So he lipped out a putt on the 16th hole, and Henrik had a putt for birdie. This was a putt for eagle that Phil had on the par 5. He had a spectacular fairway wood into the screen. Just one of his incredible strikes of the day.
Like 270, right?
Yeah. I mean, just like this was Phil Mickelson on that day. He was just flushing the ball unbelievably at historic levels. He almost made this putt. This putt kind of like died just across the hole, right? He didn't quite get it there. And so the ball just sort of, veered off course right as it was getting to the hole and went right across the front of it. If that putt had dropped, Stenson has like a 3-4 footer for birdie. I think that puts more pressure on Stenson because he knows he needs to make that putt in order to stay one up on Phil at that point, going into 17, the par 3, where Stenson ended up hitting an incredible tee shot. But if Phil's putt goes in, Stenson might miss that putt, and then they might be even going into 17. I think that math is right. My apologies if it's not.
No, you're right. It is. It's right.
So that was a big what-if moment. And then Stenson almost put it into the Greg Norman bunker on 18. That was something that I actually totally forgotten. The bunker on the right side of the fairway that Greg Norman made famous in 1989. His 3-wood nearly got to it. I mean, just in an adrenaline-fueled strike. And if he had found that bunker, then things could have definitely gone differently because at that point, I believe the separation between the two players was 2 shots. And so certainly there could have been a 2-shot swing there. All right, before we get to the big final categories here, Joseph, any stray notes or tidbits that you just wanted to touch on? Anything in your notes that you thought was interesting that you just want to get out there?
I have a bunch of notes. I'll keep it. I won't go through all of them. I did not remember this, and I'm curious if you picked up on this, Garrett, in the telecast. Walking off the 13th tee, the RNA tells Stenson and Phil to pick up the pace as they'd fallen a little bit behind, and you can barely hear it on the telecast, but it's interesting. They're in the middle of this epic duel. No one's near them on the leaderboard, and they don't get put on the clock, at least that I remember, but they're told to pick up the pace. And kind of just an interesting anecdote about that as I've reflected on it. I remember being at Dell Match Play in Austin, and Phil was playing against Stenson years later, obviously. I don't remember exactly which year. And after walking off one of the greens, Phil said to his caddy, and I was standing there and heard it in slightly more colorful language, "Man, Henrik Stenson is so freaking slow." And I've always kind of wondered if any of the 2016 Open Championship lingers a little bit there. Henrik Stenson's not the speediest golfer, and Phil does look ready to hit a lot of the shots in this 2016 Open Championship.
Yeah,
I don't
he
think
pulls
it was
the trigger
Phil.
Quickly on a couple of them.
He does. And so it's
into
just
7
interesting.
especially, I remember he hit his approach like right on top of Stenson's approach.
And some of the putts, like as Henrik Stenson's hitting them, Phil's already prepared to hit. He kind of steps in pretty quickly and hits them. There's one where he even finishes. I don't know if you remember that from the telecast, but he hits a good chip shot and decides he wants to finish like a 3-footer instead of letting Stenson hit his 6 or 7-footer. So really interesting to see the R&A tell them to pick up the pace a little bit. And then maybe some of that additional context was delighting me as I watched through that 2016 Open Championship.
I like that note, especially because then 3 years later, no, not 3 years later, more than 3 years later, this was in 2021, I guess, at PGA Championship at Kiowa. Famously, Phil sort of slow played Brooks Koepka in the final round and frustrated Koepka. So maybe Phil was taking a tip from Stenson there from the 2016 final round. That's pretty funny. All right, let's get to the last couple of categories here. Some general big picture categories. First of all, what do you think is the overwhelming key to success on this golf course, Royal Troon?
For me, it's just premier iron play. I think you see it with Phil and you see it with Stenson. When you're hitting your irons well, you have a lot of opportunities to make birdie and hit some approach shots close. And even if you're not super close, a lot of those putts are makeable. I think that's a huge key to success, not just for what I just mentioned, but you're hitting iron off a lot of tees. And given how easy the driver has become to hit, and you can hit the ball basically anywhere on the club face and it flies relatively straight, I think it's pretty difficult off the tee to flush a bunch of irons and woods, especially if wind is a factor. So I'm really hoping we get a little bit of wind, and I think you will see some of those premier ball strikers, especially the best iron players in the world, rise to the top. Obviously, like, wind can create some variance and some unpredictability in ways that is also relevant, and some of those iron players could get taken out just by being on the wrong side of a draw. But to me, I would be targeting the best iron players in the world when thinking about who's going to win this championship. How about you?
Yeah, I mean, that was my number one note for this category as well. It is totally conspicuous, totally obvious in this final round that the main differentiating factor between Stenson and Phil and everybody else is that those two players were hitting greens from distance with irons and striking their irons with a flushness and a purity that the other players simply were not matching. You saw other players missing greens, scrambling. You hardly ever saw Stenson and Phil in a position of scrambling, especially after they hit a fairway, right? If they were in the fairway, you could pretty much bank on 10, 15 feet and a birdie opportunity. And these were not the easiest conditions. And other players were showing that. Nobody else was anywhere in the vicinity of Stenson and Phil in that final round. I mean, Stenson, what did he shoot? 63? And Phil was 65? We probably should know these numbers off the top of our heads, but nobody was close to those numbers. And it was because of the iron play. If I had to choose another key to success on this golf course, it would just have to be avoiding bunkers off the tee and having a solid strategy for avoiding those bunkers. We didn't see Phil and Stenson in bunkers off the tee. Part of that may have been a little bit of luck, because you always need that luck. But also part of it was that they were thoughtful about their choices off the tee, about their lines, about the clubs that they are hitting, so that they gave themselves the best chances possible not to be in those bunkers. And I think that that's probably going to be another theme that we see in 2024.
It was 63 and 65, respectively. I mean, just cheated and looked it up.
It's absolutely incredible.
We had one more category, which was something to the effect of
biggest lesson.
And mine was avoid trouble. So I would echo that staying out of the fairway bunkers, like taking lines off of the tees that aren't going to put you in trouble, even if it means hitting an iron or a wood instead of pushing driver, trying to hit shots like on 11 that off the tee stay out of the gorse. And that's obviously easier said than done, but you're going to get your scoring opportunities if you stay out of trouble. It's not the type of golf course that you're going to be able to overpower. There are certain holes where you may be able to in the right conditions, especially if it's downwind. But generally speaking, this is a golf course to be a little bit conservative off of many of the tees and then just avoiding some of those most penal bunkers on the golf course. So that was my biggest lesson for 2024.
Agree with that. My biggest lesson for 2024 is something that we've already referred to, and that is that the wave split is God in the Open Championship. And we might see another one with unsettled weather in the forecast this year. We could see another wave split. I'm not sure which way it's going. I'm going to make a guess on that in a minute. But when the weather is volatile, then the wave split really does help determine who has the best chance at contending on the weekend. And that's just something that we see in the Open Championship more than any other tournament in the world. And it's something that you either love or hate. I happen to love it. Any form of randomness and chaos that can be introduced to this professional game that has become so rationalized and predictable in some ways, I'm all for. And so give me a wave split, even if it happens to hurt my favorite players the best, or the worst, I should say. All right, let's get into some picks and predictions. Now that we've done our categories for 2016, I think we've talked about that final round thoroughly enough. Again, going to recommend that people go see it because it's just such a fun final round, and there are probably a lot of things, even if you watched it at the time, probably a lot of things that you don't remember about what happened that day and how excellent the play from Phil and Henrik was. Let's do some picks and predictions. Who are you looking at this week for possible players who can set themselves apart in the way that Phil and Henrik did in 2016?
I listed 2 names, Garrett. I think there are a lot of the usual suspects that, Scotty, Rory,
Scotty Scheffler probably going to be pretty good.
Right. The ones that I felt worth calling out first, I think, watching this 2016, rewatching it, one name that kept kind of getting pounded into my head was Collin Morikawa. Collin has had arguably his best season. I mean, it is his best season statistically. He's been kind of red hot as of late in majors so far this year. He's finished tied for 3rd at the Masters, tied for 4th at the PGA at Valhalla, and tied for 14th at Pinehurst. Collin Morikawa obviously has already won 2 majors, including an Open Championship. I think the knock on him tends to be that he has some struggles in the wind, and that
I was just going to bring this up. What do you make of that?
That really tight cut that he hits and he goes to on every shot can turn into a little bit of a wipey fade. If you watched the Farmers Insurance this year at Torrey Pines, that fade did not work super well when it got windy, but I still trust Collin, especially on a golf course that takes driver out of your hands fairly often. If he's standing up on tees, ripping a lot of irons and woods, there's not too many golfers that I trust more in that type of setup. And he's crafty with his irons. He has the default stock fade that he likes to hit, but Collin Morikawa's got a little bit more in his bag than just a wipey fade. Unbelievable iron player. Can make a case that he's, if not the best iron player in the world, certainly top 5. His short game's come a long way this year, by far having the best short game season. I also think some of the putting on these slow greens is probably a little bit more of what he's used to on the West Coast. Man, this kind of screams Collin Morikawa to me.
It's not the hardest putting course, right? It's if you're on the green, then 2 putts are very achievable for most people. And so
Henrik
putting
Stenson's
is going to be
amazing putter.
like a tough differentiator this week, or less of a differentiator than it usually might be, because it's always a differentiator, but it might de-emphasize it a little bit this week. All right, Collin Morikawa. Now, what I like about Morikawa, I am a little bit worried about the wind thing. I mean, hitting that fade in the wind is tough, but maybe it's a bit of an overemphasized theme with Morikawa at this point, because he's a good golfer. He can handle the wind. He is in that later wave on Thursday. And something that I'm looking at, I'm not sure, it's not advisable to make predictions based on forecasts. I will just say that. But since I'm not a betting expert, I'm just going to go ahead and put all my chips in the in the forecast bucket, put all my eggs in that basket. I think that Thursday morning is going to be tough. I think there's some weather coming in late Wednesday, and it's going to be kind of clearing out on Thursday morning. I think that players could have a harder time on Thursday morning than they do on Thursday afternoon. And so I'm mainly looking at players who go out on Thursday afternoon. Now, some of the players who go out in the morning on Thursday: Justin Thomas, Joaquin Niemann, Tony Finau, John Rahm, Tommy Fleetwood, Brian Harmon. This is starting to get a little bit later in the morning, but Rory McIlroy's going out at about 10 a.m. Tyrrell Hatton, Max Homa, Keegan Bradley are going out in kind of mid-morning. Now, afternoon players, would include Corey Connors, Jason Day, Phil Mickelson. He had an afternoon tee time in 2016 on Thursday, and it worked to his advantage then. It could again this time. Wyndham Clark, Hideki, Brooks, Xander, Cantlay, Morikawa, Sam Burns, Shane Lowry, Cameron Smith, Matt Fitzpatrick, Scotty Scheffler. Few other names there, but that's basically the pool of players that I'm looking at. I like Morikawa in that group of players. Tell me if this is stupid, but I'm kind of looking at Shane Lowry. I like that name. I think he's really good with his mid and long irons. He did well last week.
He's playing pretty well coming in, and if there's somebody that can brave the elements, I know this always gets brought up with Shane Lowry, but former Open champion, he's done it. He'll be very comfortable no matter what weather gets thrown at him. I don't think it's a crazy pick. Also interesting to me that you mentioned Corey Connors, because I didn't know that he'd get the first Bill shout out there, but Corey Connors is an elite ball striker, and he's having a really good season. So he is kind of an interesting name to keep an eye on.
I feel like people always bring up Corey Connors when it comes to major championships because it's a lot of courses that reward great ball striking, great mid and long iron play more than PGA Tour courses tend to reward that skill. And Corey Connors is your ultimate example of somebody who has an outsized skill in that area. But yeah, Corey Connors, the reason I mentioned him first is he's going out earliest in the afternoon, but he is in the afternoon wave. And then
it's a draw.
Yeah.
He's one of the few players in professional golf that hits a tight draw.
You would think he plays well in the wind. I don't know if there's evidence that he plays well in windy conditions because we just don't get that much in the way of windy conditions anywhere on the schedule. I mean, Matt Fitzpatrick is another, legendary mutter who can play well in various conditions. I don't know if he's in the greatest form of his career or anything like that. But then obviously Scotty Scheffler's going out late on Thursday, and that could be a major advantage for him. Brooks Koepka is somebody that I've brought up in every major so far this year. It hasn't really worked out for me that well in any of the majors this year, but I'm always looking at his name because it's not wise to doubt him in a major championship. Now, Bryson DeChambeau, the most talked about player of the year, probably, maybe other than Rory, but talked about for different reasons. Do you think he struggles at this course? Is it like too easy of a take to say that he might struggle here? I think it is. And let me just say why.
Sure.
He's a great long iron player. I mean, if we're looking at long and mid irons as the differentiating factor, then he could be great, but I'm not sure how much he's looking to hit driver on this course. But if it's a long iron contest, and for Bryson, the long irons are like the 7 and 8 irons, but if it's a contest from those distances, he does really, really well from those distances. Now, his ball might be a little bit high, but I don't know. I mean, like, it seems like he should be able to thrive with this kind of test. But I think we just assume that when it comes to links golf, Bryson is not your man.
I wouldn't have Bryson quite as high as I would have some of these other players, but I do think Bryson, I'm not too concerned about the way that he lines up at the golf course like this, maybe in the way that I would have been in the past. I think he has some advantages in that he understands the way that his ball interacts with the wind and leans into that a little bit more than a lot of players probably do, understanding that your dispersion gets wider when you're playing into the wind, and that just bashing driver all of the time isn't always the best strategy. And I think Bryson went a little bit far in that direction when he put on all of his distance. I think he's learned to rein that in a little bit and has expressed that. His caddy, I know that he had gone on the Get a Grip podcast, a Fried Egg Pod, and had talked a little bit about some of the considerations they make. And, this is a little bit maybe less of a calculated tournament than a lot of other ones, but as his caddy Jibo said on that pod, like, Bryson's a pretty darn good field player, even though he has a rap as being calculated about everything. So I think that course management and ability to understand the right shots to hit and how he's evolved in that way is a reason to be optimistic about Bryson. Again, I wouldn't put him as high as a McIlroy or a Scheffler or a Schauffele or a Morikawa, frankly, in terms of his chances of winning, but certainly wouldn't be surprised if he's in the mix. Can I give you another name? Or
absolutely.
I think one golfer flying a little bit under the radar is Louis Oosthuizen. And Louis Oosthuizen is actually playing really good golf, and he's getting some respect in the betting markets, but he doesn't have the visibility, right? He's playing on LIV, which is a tour that just doesn't have nearly as many eyeballs on it as the PGA Tour. He hasn't played a major this entire year, but he's been playing very solidly on LIV, and he's a golfer who's been good in majors pretty much his entire career. I think he's finished in 8 top 10s in 32 starts since 2015, like a 25% clip, which isn't bad. He's 41, and this is a major that generally some of the more seasoned players can have success
Henrik
in.
and Phil were both in their 40s when they in 2016.
He finished 23rd in this event last year. He finished tied for third at St. Andrews in 21. Kind of has done well on some courses that, like, I don't think Chambers Bay is the perfect comparison for Royal Troon, but like he did very well there despite a bad opening round, and just I think he's a flusher that has a lot of shots. Former Open champion. I would not be ruling out Louis Oosthuizen.
That's an incredible shout. I would not have picked out that name, but Louis Oosthuizen is Louis Oosthuizen. I mean, he just shows up and performs in majors. It hasn't happened for a couple of years at this point, but he's one of those players that can just turn it on for a week and shock everybody. Nobody picks him, and all of a sudden he's there. So
he won twice in December on the DP World Tour. Like he's been good.
Well, okay. What do you think of Cameron Smith? He's going out in the afternoon on Thursday. How is he playing? Another LIV player that I just have a hard time assessing.
I've had a hard time assessing Cameron Smith too. I don't think I'd be as optimistic based on what he's put out so far.
Yeah, his form has been kind of not inspiring.
Yeah, I thought Pinehurst would probably be a better showing, and he hasn't shown that much, but like, yeah, I don't know. He finished T2 at LIV Singapore. I don't really know exactly what to make of that. I think it does have meaning. It was probably for too long thought that they had no meaning. Like, I think there's some meaning in the results, but it's hard to evaluate exactly
approximately as much meaning as there is for like a signature event. Maybe less, because the field isn't quite as strong as a signature event, but we're talking about a small field kind of event. No cut.
Yeah, I think Cam Smith, he's almost 31. He may end up being the type of player that had that surge, and it happened a little bit, not late in his career, but kind of in the middle, and then maybe flamed. I don't want to say flamed out, but I'm not as optimistic about Cam Smith this year until we see a little bit more form.
Yeah, he certainly had a run of exceptional form for a couple of years, but hasn't necessarily shown that he can sustain that. But who knows? Like, he's obviously a great player. His short game, his putting, amazing. And I just think, like, when we're looking at him, just a couple of years ago he was winning an Open championship, and now we just don't talk about him as much. And maybe for some decent reasons because of his recent form, but he just is a guy who's there and who might be a factor. All right, so we have had a really good run of major championships this year. I think the majors this year have been absolutely exceptional. Actually, I can't remember a year of majors that was this solid across the board. I mean, probably there has been one in the past 10, 15 years that I'm forgetting right now, but the Masters was great. The PGA Championship was really fun to watch. And then the US Open was an all-timer. I know it's hard to predict these things, but do you think we could be set up for another really fun major? Or is this the type of course and setup that could maybe lead to a little bit of disappointment, maybe kind of a low energy major like we saw at last year's Open at Hoylake?
I mean, I would expect it to be an exciting major, and I think it's a great golf course that brings out a lot of cool shots. So kind of, as we've talked about before, like some of that Thursday to Saturday entertainment value, like I think it's going to be really high, especially if we get some wind. Given that there's going to be some blustery, wet conditions, I think if players are playing through that, then it's unlikely that we get a runaway unless there's a huge wave split, right? Like, it's blustery and rainy in the morning on Thursday, but then in the afternoon, the golfers are playing a calm, soft course. Then that increases the chances that somebody in that wave gets really hot and pulls away. My expectation would be that this is a great major. Sure, you could have somebody like Brian Harman, who is a great player, run away from it and make it a little bit sleepier, but I'm going into it with the expectation of it being a great golf tournament.
All right, Joseph, thanks for coming on the pod. Hoping for a great week this week. And I think we'll probably reconvene afterwards for a little takeaways podcast.
Sounds great. Let's have a good tournament.
This episode of the Fried Egg Golf Podcast was produced by PJ Clark. Thank you, PJ. If you'd like to support the Fried Egg Podcast on another level, then consider joining Club TFE. Go to thefriedegg.com/membership and see what we have to offer there. We do a lot of exclusive content, course profiles, design notebook, tour guide, all that kind of stuff. And we're building a wonderful community in Club TFE of golf sickos who just love the game, love talking about the game, and we're really excited about it. So Club TFE, thefriedegg.com/membership, see what it's all about. And in the meantime, enjoy Open Week. We'll see you on the other side for another episode.